Good morning. My name's Pam Honan. I'm the Director of Youth and Family Violence Services based in Tasmania in Australia. Welcome to day two of the Asian Youth Justice Conference. The theme of today's sessions is working together to improve the system. I'm about to introduce you to my first speaker, but before doing so, we'd like to run through some general housekeeping to make sure that you can fully participate in today's sessions. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the live support button at the top of your screen, and to view this on a large screen, click the arrows on the top right of your video. I'll now introduce you to each speaker, and at the end of each presentation, we'll respond to questions in the QA box. If the time is up, we need to move on to the next speaker. We will answer the questions at a session. So this morning, our first speaker is Steve Barracosa from the Youth Justice area of New South Wales. Steve will be presenting today on at-risk and radicalised youth offenders, countering violent extremism in an evolving Australian context. Welcome, Steve.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Pam, for your introduction. Thank you guys for having me. I think it goes without saying it's been a really great conference so far, and hopefully I can add some interesting content to that very quickly this morning in what is a slightly undesirable topic, slightly confronting in some ways, but from a youth justice perspective, a topic in an area of real potential. And I guess we're talking about a small cohort of young people that are embarking on a journey in and around extreme beliefs and behaviours in many different shapes and sizes. And we'll touch on that very quickly while we're together this morning. Before I dive into this, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, I guess, in Australia and New Zealand, in different parts of both countries this morning, and pay both my and our respects present and, of course, emerging. Now, 15 minutes is scarcely enough time for us to discuss the topics that we'd love to discuss, so I'm going to jump straight into some content. While we're together this morning, I'd love to take the opportunity to highlight very quickly the rather unfortunate presence of youth across what we would call Australia's countering violent extremism landscape. We'll take the opportunity to review, I suppose, what's been a couple of really distinctive chapters for youth justice as an agency in terms of the way we look and feel about countering violent extremism and working with young people in relation to extreme beliefs and behaviours. It's a great chance today to have a look at some of the core challenges that we face in this space, but also some of the key lessons that we've learnt along the way. And I guess ultimately I'd love for people to walk away from this feeling that youth criminal justice settings, and I would argue youth agencies in general, are actually in a really healthy and really useful position to contribute to effectively and efficiently identifying young people in and around extreme groups and movements. And I guess putting into place really dynamic, robust, practitioner-based frameworks to move young people away from extremism as quickly as we possibly can. I would also love people to walk away, if possible, feeling that while CVE comes with a lot of connotations, a lot of challenges, and often a lot of stigma, maybe the youth CVE space needs to be seen through a different lens, and maybe there is scope for youth-specific approaches to CVE, to be soft, to be engaging, to be very much like the other approaches that we'd apply to address a range of topics with young people across all of our different agencies. And we might take the opportunity to set the tone for the years ahead where there is utility in youth CVE and there is scope for it to be engaging, dynamic, and very much youth-centric. Really quickly, I want to touch on a couple of things in relation to, I guess, the background of this topic. There is some incredible work that happens across the Western world from state, territory and federal government perspectives in and around social cohesion and developing resilient youth. And we're talking about most youth agencies contributing to developing pro-social, stable and pluralistic young people. And ultimately, the hope is that that safeguards young people from engaging in a host of negative behaviours. The work that we do at Youth Justice New South Wales, like most youth agencies, I'd like to think certainly contributes to that. But the discussion today, I suppose, is a little bit after the fact for a really small cohort of young people that I suppose are slipping through those social cohesion and youth resilience nets and in some way engaging in some form of extreme belief and behaviour. What do we know about this countering violent extremism landscape? Well, historically, the discussions, the policy, the practices have been far too heavily focused on adults. We know that we've spoken historically too much about terrorism, too much about violent extremism, too many buzzwords, too many kind of pointy end of the stick type conversations. And I feel like we've left the youth CVE space behind a little bit in that regard. And there isn't a lot of precedent for how we would approach young people, how we would work with young people, and I guess how we would do this differently, given that youth are a fundamentally different cohort. All of that's happening in a climate here in Australia and truthfully across most of the Western world, where we know that small numbers of young people are being effectively targeted and recruited by different extreme groups and movements. We know that Australia's government has become increasingly outspoken about the fact that Australian youth in small numbers, I guess, are being engaged by extreme groups and movements at increasingly younger ages. And we've seen our government talking this year around 12 and 13-year-olds popping up on our national security radar or our countering violent extremism type landscape. What I really like is finally in the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen some commentary from the government that says if we're to talk about young people in relation to extreme beliefs and behaviours, then we need to apply a youth-specific lens. We need to apply a youth-specific lens to understand why young people are being exposed, why young people are being influenced by extremism, and ultimately, and most importantly, how we draw up quite dynamic and client-focused case management frameworks to get young people away from this space as effectively and as efficiently as we possibly can. So for us as an agency, we've had a couple of very distinctive chapters in how we feel about this space. And we've landed, I guess, in 2021 in what we call a practitioner-based CVE space. So we have a very small, very soft practitioner-focused unit. We work across what we call the spectrum of risk, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. There's no doubt that we're seeing small numbers of young people across a range of different ideological or extreme type groups and movements. And we've spoken historically lots about groups like the Islamic State, religiously inspired extremism. We're talking more in recent times about, I suppose, what we call right-wing extremism, particularly with a racist, nationalist, white supremacist type feel. But our unit, we'd like to think, has fallen in a place that is very much in line with the way we operate as an agency here in New South Wales from a youth criminal justice perspective. So holistic approaches, systemic contributions, client-focused at all times, particularly on the young people that we're working with. And truthfully, working with young people as we do working with our staff. So we run a lot of training, we provide a lot of support and capacity building opportunities for staff to, I guess, effectively identify young people that might be on their way towards some type of engagement with extremism. And I suppose trying to demystify and create a level of comfort from our staff that it's okay to talk about this topic. And in truth, the sooner we talk about it, the sooner we get a chance to address it and divert young people away from it. One of the big takeaways I'd love people to walk away with today is, whilst this topic often comes with a lot of scrutiny, too many buzzwords, and a lot of high-profile type discussions, I actually think we need to reshift that from a youth perspective, and we need to talk a little bit about extremism and a little bit about engaging and being influenced by extremism, but a lot about youth vulnerability and whether that be psychosocial challenges or developmental challenges. I think we need to find a balance in terms of how we approach this space from a youth perspective. And in part, sure, it's about extremism, but it's also a lot about discussions that we're all fairly comfortable and familiar with. And I think that vulnerability risk type balance, we've got some work to do to improve our comfort and our capacity to have those discussions on a regular basis. I also want to point out really quickly, we don't have a tidal wave of young people engaging in extreme groups or movements that are mobilising towards violence, and that's fundamentally a really good thing. But we have a really small cohort that pop up from time to time that are characterised by incredibly complex profiles. And I think youth agencies, particularly youth criminal justice settings, are in a really nice position to contribute to addressing some of those challenges. So really quickly, I think I've already touched on the fact that too many of the discussions in and around countering violent extremism exist at the pointy end of the spectrum. We will always have a small cohort of young people who are either charged or convicted for terrorism offences. We will always have a really small cohort of young people that are highly engaged and committed to extreme groups and movements. But I would argue that that doesn't characterise the youth CVE landscape, and we need to spend significantly more time focusing on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is what we would call the at-risk space. And in essence, it entails a small cohort of young people that have inherent vulnerabilities and a level of exposure to some kind of extreme group or movement, where we're in the early stages of exploring extremism, in the early stages of engaging in some form of extremism. And I think some of the terms we use at that early end of the spectrum are terms like prevention, terms like early identification, terms like early intervention, terms that are inherently kind of familiar to youth agencies and to youth practitioners, and I think fundamentally less confronting for youth agencies and practitioners as well. So while we're together, really quickly, I want to touch on a couple of key challenges that we've faced. There is no question that globally, the CVE landscape wrestles with challenges around how you engage, assess, intervene, case manage both youth and adults in the absence of stigma and labels. And there isn't kind of a perfect best practice. There is no doubt that this is a particularly pronounced challenge when it comes to working with young people. I suppose for us as an agency, we've fallen in a place where we'd like to see our CVE framework as incredibly soft, ultra consultative. We don't do a lot of formal, we don't hinge our existence on intelligence or law enforcement type frameworks. We're really looking for practitioners to, I guess, establish a degree of capacity to feel comfortable discussing this topic, to consult with our CVE framework in relation to this topic, and to do so from a practitioner-based focus at all times. So we have an incredible and robust screening process that involves systemic contributions from all of the agencies and practitioners that are engaged with the small cohort of young people that ultimately come to our attention. We love that information sharing provisions are really pronounced in New South Wales, and there's a real willingness from most youth agencies and practitioners to engage in the idea that we need to do this efficiently and as early as we possibly can. We have a high-risk panel that provides oversight for our functions, oversight for us receiving endorsement to engage a young person, and we have representation from agencies like Child Protection and Child and Adolescent Forensic Mental Health Services towards a couple of things. And the first is ensuring that we're having balanced discussions in that screening around vulnerability and risk for engaging in extremism, risk for being, I suppose, radicalised to something like violent extremism, but also to ensure that we have engaging a very small number of young people where there is a fair blanket agreement that there is some work to be done both from a youth vulnerability and extremism perspective. And it's not perfect. We think that our screening process will certainly evolve over time. But at the moment, it's functioning in the absence of labels, in the absence of any significant consequences for young people, certainly in the absence of any changes to their supervision, whether that be custody-based or community-based supervision. In the ballpark of getting a grasp of this, we can do youth CVE in the absence of stigma, but there's no doubt there's a whole lot more to learn, and we will continue to move forward, wrestling with that idea that we can and need to engage young people in this in a very soft manner that comes without stigma, without labels, and without consequences for the young people that we're engaged with. Second challenge that we've got, if my slides flick over, is, I suppose, really quickly around assessment and case management. We would argue that as an agency, we feel it's necessary to add some extremism-specific insights and considerations for a small cohort of young people. For the most part, our framework should look and feel like the rest of the agency. So really transparent, voluntary at all time, client-focused and systemic, practitioner-based engagements with young people. We use and capacity build local staff, psychologists, caseworkers, teachers, mentors, educational and vocational programs. All of that stuff can lend itself really nicely to CVE. So in some ways, I suppose we feel that we don't need to reinvent the wheel to introduce CVE to a youth criminal justice setting. We just need to contribute some CVE to that plethora of resources that already exist. And ultimately, it means that we're just blending into the crowd. We're adopting normal process, all of those really dynamic, engaging kind of resources that are already in place. And ultimately, from a CVE perspective, it probably given the resource allocation and how client-centric those environments are in a really nice position if we could just add some extremism discussions from time to time to contribute to identifying and intervening with young people in this space as early and as efficiently as we possibly can. We also talk lots about challenges around working with young people. There's also challenges for the small cohort of practitioners that live in this space. There's more work to do around professional development. There's to do around supervision. There's more work to do around community of practice opportunities. So there's lots to learn about how we work with people, and there's lots to learn about how we look after the practitioners that are engaged in working in this youth-specific CVE landscape. Last slide for me, and really quickly, a couple of lessons learned and a couple of takeaways from here. There's no question we'll effectively work with young people in this countering violent extremism landscape. We need to apply a youth-specific approach, so a soft, client-focused, consultative and developmentally informed lens on all of the young people that we work with. And we need to increase our comfort having discussions where there is a level of vulnerability and also a level of risk in an extremist perspective. I would argue tooth and nail that the language of of early identification, of early intervention is not only the language of youth agencies and youth practitioners, but it's the language that should characterise the way we operate from a youth CVE perspective. No question that the resources that exist across youth agencies are the best friend of CVE if we can find a way to get this right. And ultimately, whilst this topic can at times be a bit confronting, a bit confusing, and certainly a bit concerning, it's an area of serious potential for the small cohort of young people that we're working with, whether that be at-risk spectrum for a small cohort of at-risk youth, or for that really pointy end of the spectrum where we have a small cohort of young people that you would describe as highly engaged in extremism. They are young, their lives are still going state of flux. And if we can maximise opportunities to give them some scope to engage in assessments and case management frameworks, it's an area of huge potential and of great value to the young people that we're working with, and if we get this right, to the community as well. So that's a lot of content in a really short period of time, and I'm conscious I've probably gone over time. If we don't have time, I'm always available for a chat, questions, comments, concerns, complaints or otherwise. My details are on the screen. Thank you guys for joining me. I hope you have an amazing time at the conference, and with a bit of luck, we'll all get to catch up in person sometime too far down the track. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. Question. I note that the CVE is New South Wales based. If there are other jurisdictions that recognise young people that may have extremist views, how might they access your service direction and advice about how to use the resources you have to work with these young people?
A couple of points to that, Pam, and it's an amazing question. Most jurisdictions some form of CVE framework that whether or not they can engage the young people or just provide some kind of support to jurisdictions. State to state, the frameworks are different. I've been screaming this from the rooftops for months and months, is that whilst we are really lucky from a Youth Justice New South Wales perspective to have a resource, the capacity for any jurisdiction to reach out for a chat, some advice, a level of consultation, I think needs to increase, particularly from a youth-specific perspective. So if anybody has questions about young people, if any jurisdiction has some concerns or some queries that they might like to throw through us, given that we live in this space exclusively, I guess my advice would be reach out. Let's reach out for a chat. And I think what the youth CVE space really needs is more discussions, more consultation, borders and across jurisdictions, and more opportunities for all of us, irrespective of where the young people might be falling in our systems, for our agencies to put our heads together and do as much as we possibly can in this space. So if we can contribute as an agency elsewhere.
I have a couple of other questions. One of them is, do you think speaking with vulnerable at-risk young people about put the idea in their head?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's why our social cohesion and community resilience government frameworks don't directly address extremism. And I think that's a really healthy way to approach this. I suppose for us, our screening process is designed to ensure that the young people that we are engaging with as a unit are already past that point of exploring and exposing themselves to extremism. So I would say as a unit, we wouldn't engage young people that are so early in that kind of trajectory that we might plant some seeds or introduce them to content. We, as an agency, would be looking at a really small number of young people that have already gone past that point, that are consuming content, that are using rhetoric, that are engaging with extreme associates, in which case they often are looking forward to discussing the topic and potentially being challenged in relation to some of what they're being exposed to. But the risk, without question, from a screening perspective, is we don't want to topic into young people's minds if it isn't already there, and our screening process is designed for them to ensure that we're not engaged appropriately with young people who we might then expose to things that they hadn't previously been exposed to.
Thanks, Steve. Another question, is there legislation or regulation of the CVE in New South Wales?
A couple of parts. I mean, we have that's endorsed by our agency. We're obviously at Youth Justice New South Wales, so we're guided by our own agency frameworks and so on. There is, I suppose, a CVE legislative climate that most would be somewhat familiar with, and it's hugely confronting and hugely concerning in some ways. Our youth is being empowered by our to avoid having to have any discussions about young people in a legislative CVE space. So we're bound in terms of our operations by our internal functions, by our practice guide, by our rules and regulations from a youth justice perspective. And I guess at the pointy end of the spectrum, the earlier we identify, the earlier and more effectively we intervene, the less as an agency we need to ever go down that path of talking about kind of CVE-specific legislation in relation to young confronting, hugely unhelpful. And if we do this well, we feel avoid having to do that.
Okay, and I've got one more quick question. How much engagement do you have with the family of the young person, and do you engage with the family around the vulnerability of that young person presents?
Yeah, I think all youth justice settings engage so heavily from a systemic perspective, community and so on. We're no different. So we are adopting that kind of youth justice. Those discussions are certainly about more so vulnerability than extremism. And it all goes to case management. It all goes to diversion. It all goes to building resilience and ensuring that we can move young as an agency as effectively as we can away from this space. And I think most of those discussions with family, without question, hinge on developmental and psychosocial type vulnerabilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. It's been a really informative session. I'd like to now introduce our second speaker this morning, who is Tommy Wilson. Tommy will, and I apologise up front for my probable pronunciation, Tuinga, Whānau, Oranga, Tamariki. So welcome, Tommy, as our next speaker.
Kia ora morena, it's the Tommy and Carl show. This is my young brother next to me, Carl Goldsbury. I'm Tommy Kapai Wilson. Kia ora, good morning to Aotearoa and to our Indigenous First Nation brothers and sisters, our Ngāti Skazis across there over in Australia, especially to my friends in Woolgoolga there in New South Wales, who the native Aboriginal dialect mainstream in their school, and I had the pleasure of being with them and watching that learn. So, yep, Tuinga is a social service community group here in Tauranga Moana, and we practice tikanga Māori in all sectors, not just youth justice, but we look after 200 families. We have a staff of just over 100. So whether it's youth justice, at risk, homeless, addicted, coming out of jail, we apply the Indigenous principles of tikanga. We have prepared a video that can explain in 7 minutes what me and Carl would take half an hour to explain to. I'm just going to hand over to Carl to introduce himself and let you know what his mahi is. Then I'll come back and then we'll play you a video. So sit back, enjoy, and we'll take questions at the end and draw the raffle and all go home happy. So this is my brother, Carl Goldsbury.
Kia ora, everybody. Yep, my name's Carl Goldsbury. Yep, so my work consists of, so I'm an active gang member. I've been into jail lots of times myself, spent over probably 10 to 15 years in prison. So now I've sort of turned my life around. I was a drug addict for 20 years, so I've been clean for 7 now. So now what I do is I go back into the prison and help people out like myself, just tidy up themselves and get out of jail and get into a good life back out here in the community and do positive things. So on the back end of that, so I've been helping with some of our youth. So I've been going also to the youth prisons and just helping mentor our young men, especially just talking on personal experiences, I guess, just talking honestly and openly with them. Any questions that I can help them with, any answers, you know, obviously not trying to steer them down the wrong way, but down the right way, just telling them what happens if you do go down the wrong way, that it's not worth it. It just took me 20 years to work that out. I want to cut that into only 1 year for them, hopefully. It's real rewarding, as I've got sons of my own, so it's really rewarding to know that there is people that do give you chances, and that's what we are now. So it's good. I really like this mahi, and it's good to be able to help and give back. So yeah, kia ora, everybody.
Kia ora. Thank you, brother. Yeah, as I said, we do have a video presentation that explains what we do and how we do it in a different way, but it's a way we know that works. Our tupuna, our ancestors have been doing it for ages, and then you look over there for 40,000 years, our First Nation Indigenous people have been practicing this tikanga in a short 300 or 400 years, our Caucasian cousins have come along and pretty much stuffed it up. So at the end of this, we're happy to take questions. We're happy for you to download this and get in touch with us. We'll leave you an email address, and the video presentation is dated by about 10 months now. We've been going hard since February last year at the front line, enjoy. We'll come back to you and take questions at the end. That would be great. So kia ora everybody, and over to you, Mr. Button Pushing Man.
Kia ora. My name is Tommy Kapai Wilson, and I am the Chief Imagination Officer of Tuinga Whānau Support Services. Tuinga means to weave the community together, and that's pretty much what we've been doing for the last 35 years. But in the last 7 years, we've done things a little different. So how have we, how are we, and how will we be joining the community together? Firstly, the homeless and the hungry. That was our first biggest challenge. When we started with one house. And from there, over the last 5 years, we've built it up into 20 houses, 4 motels, and the RSA. So right now, as of today, we have 200 families that are under our flock or in our korowai of kindness. And we aren't stopping there. Whare kōwhai. Whare kōwhai is the engine room, where our social service team, who provide and produce social surgery to traumatic people on a daily basis, are based at the RSA at the Whare kōwhai. And what a beautiful team of awhi angels they are. The RSA. When COVID came along, so did Fred, the president of the RSA. And with us and them, we formed the first COVID village for the homeless, and it's grown and grown strength to strength. 24 rooms, turning over 24 families that we then fix up and send up to a better accommodation until they too get long-term accommodation. Welcome to the Whare Awhi. What is the Whare Awhi? Awhi means to embrace, to wrap your arms around, and that's what we want to do. We want to create a papakainga for the homeless based on the principles of Awhi. So I guess that makes us awhi angels, the ones that will be working there. So what is Whare Awhi? So at the moment we have 30 odd properties, rooms, premises that we service looking after about 50 to 60 families, paying about $500,000 a year in rent. And our contract is a 3-year contract, so what we would like to do in 3 years' time is to move from some of the damp, oldest properties to new, warm, self-contained properties like we've seen today. So that is our game plan, not to renew in 3 years' time back into the old, damp and wet, but into the new, bold, warm Whare Awhi. That's what this is about. Our biggest challenge is that we have to move from family to family, whare to whare. And our resources and our time and our people are spent mainly moving from whare to whare to whare. So how cool would it be if we had a Whare Awhi, a papakainga for the homeless in one place where we can look after 30 families at once in the same place? Because we know that if you can wrap around and jumper lead these families when they're in a warm, dry environment, they don't go back to being poor tenants. Hence, we have these wonderful, wonderful modules that we want to put together in a village concept. Is it the first village of this sort in the country? Possibly is. Are we the village people? I don't know, but I'm up for YMCA if it helps the families that we want to help move forward. So if we can transition families 10 at a time, maybe 2-3 lots a year, that makes for 30 families that are going back into the community as good tenants. So it's very much transitional. They're not parking up forever. This is where they're going to stay to learn how to be good tenants. You know, to grow a kai, to cook a kai, all of those things that possibly they haven't had the opportunity like we've had. So this is that one-stop shop, the Whare Awhi, the papakainga for the homeless. So nau mai, hara mai, once again, come in, help us to help those that need the help most by helping us create a whare awhi. The elderly has been the new challenge where do these people go, these taonga, those that have lived their life to the fullest, contributed to the community and now can't afford rent. So we have the whare taonga, where we look after our treasured elder people. They need to be reconnected as well. So those are the two new areas that we have found post-COVID, which is the working poor and the elderly. The happy puku and the puku patch. The recipe is simple. When you can learn how to grow a kai, cook a kai, and hunt a kai, and catch a kai, you know how it is, everything will be ka pai. And these are the vital tools in the kit, or the kete, at Te Tuinga. When they get that hope, when they get that kindness, and they get some kai to cook. The puku patch. Grow kai on a scale, feed up to 500 people a day through what we are calling the puku bowls, or the bowl of plenties, a bowl of kai served with kindness for those that need good, healthy, nutritious kai. The disconnected youth. We now have two whare tuhua and whare rāranga, to create a safe haven for our youth who we don't want to see go into the incarceration system. What we could see as a normal, as much as normal as possible, family home, surrounded by house parents and caregivers who have come from many of the backgrounds these young youth have. Recently released prisoners, mentors from beyond the wire while they're still within the wire is the solution. Working with Te Ao Marama unit in Waikeria prison, finding good men who want to do good things with their families when they come out is what we're doing right now with Hini Wirangi Kohu within the wire, the fire within the wire, and Carl Goldsberry outside of the wire. And it's working, and it's wonderful to see. I guess all of our 70 plus staff are feathers in the korowai of kindness at Te Tuinga, and part of that korowai is opening up the arts and the crafts, rāranga weaving, music, piano playing, theatre, whakairo and carving. These are the tools that will help these, not only kids but adults, reconnect with their culture and show them the pathway back to their tūranga waiwai. So there it is, Whānau, Te Tuinga and Tikanga, hand in hand, working in a way that not only do we take the ambulance away from the top of the cliff, we put new drivers in them and drive those ambulances away, back home to where they belong, with their whānau, their friends and their family. This is how we reconnect the disconnect. Ora mai whānau, join us and help us to help others and be part of the solution. Kia ora.
So that's we're good to go. That's a snapshot of what we do here at Te Tuinga, and given the YJ, the Youth Justice Forum, and the kōrero of this kaupapa today, it's very relevant. How we address the youth problem is no different to how we address the homeless problem, the addicted, or the incarcerated. All about how we lead them. But the big key for us is it has to be in a language that they can engage in. So if you've got someone like Carl who speaks the language, not only speaks it, but comes from a first-hand experience, these kids will relate to it because they don't want to know what we know until they know what we care. Hey, brother, how's your feelings about that?
Yeah, I suppose when you're like that, when you've always been opposite to the law, I suppose you trust your fellow crooks, I suppose you could put it. So people will always relate to people on the same level. So when they know that you've been like them, where you are like them and whatnot, they drop the old they drop the guard a lot quicker. So they trust you a lot more because what you're saying is actually true. And these young fellas, they know that. They know what it smells like. They know what it tastes like. So they're pretty good with you. So it's yeah, it is a good cheap way to get in the door with them, and it is good to use my bad past for actually something good. So it's all been for something instead of just a waste of the last 30 years of my life. So it's actually good to be able to help install some goodness into these young fellas these days, because yeah, they've got a lot of big shortage of manners in these young fellas these days, and we need to get them back on track. It's like they've missed a whole, something. Yeah, but no, it is rewarding and it is good.
Yeah, so our relationship with OT through the AYJC sector is we are all communicating in a language we all understand. And I think the best compliment we've had from our old kaumātua at the marae, Uncle Frank, when we're having one of our small conferences with YJ staff there, he said to me, Tom, the only thing I can't work out is who's the staff and who are the clients. And that's a huge compliment, because that is, we have to speak in a language not academically for our colleagues and peers and for those that make the policy, which are important, but for those that we need to desperately engage and connect with. And that's something that I'd like to leave on this table in this very important format that we've been given the window or the matapihi of opportunity to share today. So open to any questions, and if we don't know the answers, me and the brother will make them up.
Thanks, guys. It was a really inspiring video to watch. I love the fact that it's transitional. It's still incredibly comprehensive. It's much about sustainability. It's about increasing also the amenity of the kind of facilities and stuff that you currently have started with, but continuously improve. So on that, my question is, you talked about you deal with, you work with a lot of different people, from the homeless to the elderly to youth to prisoners being released back into the community. Are they housed in the same dwellings or the same facilities, or do you have particular groups that you house in particular places? Can you talk a little more about what that looks like?
Yeah. Well, we kind of have three layers. When we first come into contact with the most at risk, we have the RSA, which we converted into like a 24-bedroom hostel, and that's where we assess and start the first rules of engagement, if you like to call it that. And then from there, the longer term gain is to get them into their individual houses. But out of that, we have a wonderful cohort of youth, which we place with Carl and his leadership team, and we do things like traditional Māori fishing, where they learn how to grow, make their own line. They learn how to catch a feed. My brother's a crazy chef, 26 years in Paris. He teaches them how to start with an onion, because many of these boys have only ever cooked with a microwave, never ever cooked in an oven after intergenerational poverty. So yeah, I think what's the key to this is our filter is very strong, because as I said before, half of us have been where these young boys are. So we know how to get to them quickly and assess how their wound, their damage, and then to start that process of putting those broken pieces back together again. Long answer to your question, but we don't just throw them all in one melting pot. They are assessed in a filter from the very first moment they arrive with us. And so are those that come through the YJ system. What house we put them in is a collaboration between Oranga Tamariki workers and our frontline staff. And from there, they know where they are best suited. So that's how that filter happens.
And from what you're describing, very practical based, very hands-on.
Totally. Yeah, we like to think our success rate is about 86%, which is pretty phenomenal, given when we first started, they had what was called alternative education, which was throw them in a European environment for 5 hours with European teachers, and then throwing them back in the same houses that are mostly dysfunctional and expecting magic to happen. Well, guess what? That magic don't happen that way. But when you engage them in the classroom, that's the boat or the bush, and the playground is the area around them, that's when they will start to engage. So really important, whether it's Aotearoa or over there in Australia, we've all got good bush, we've got great rivers, we've got great outdoor life, and that's what I liked about that Woolgoolga school. The cream was the Indigenous language was spoken mainstream in that little school out of Coffs Harbour, and man, it works. So it all adds up to a lot. The answers are sitting on our ancestors' shoulder. They're not all answers that you'll find in a screen or on TikTok.
Thank you so much,
Yep.
Tommy and Carl. We've actually run out of time, but I would like to thank you so much for the presentation you provided today. It's really inspiring and you're doing some. So thank you so much. I'd like to now introduce our final speaker for the morning, who is Alayne Mckee from Talking Trouble. Alayne will be presenting the session, Collaborating to Ensure Good Communication Practice in Family Group Conferencing. Welcome, Alayne.
Kia ora te whānau, ko Alayne Mckee tōku ingoa. Lovely to be here. Thank you for your time. I would love to be able to see you, but I'm going to imagine lots of smiling faces looking at me. And as Pam kindly said, I'm here to talk about supporting communication within FGCs. And as you'll see, I'm going to mention layers of collaboration that can happen to make sure that everybody can understand what's going on, can participate in what they want to, say what they need to say, and enact their rights. Just trying to get my slides to move. Sorry about that. So very briefly, talking to Aroa, New Zealand, we're all speech language therapists, and some of us work as communication assistants as well, and we're a social enterprise. And we work in a range of different justice, care and protection, behaviour, mental health settings. But today, of course, I'm just going to focus on supporting communication within the FGC. Now, I've got a lot of slides, but I'm not going to talk about a lot of them. I wanted to give you some examples that you can look at your leisure when you have a chance to see the slides later on. But why do we need to think about communication? Why do we need to support it? Well, young people tell us that when adults talk to them with flash words, long sentences, when they give them lots of stuff to read, when they expect them to concentrate for a long time or talk about difficult topics, that's really challenging for them. And it makes them feel really uncomfortable and confused and can make it hard for them to say what they want to say or understand what they need to do. And what makes it worse is that stress, the stress of the communication, often then means that they do things that adults perceive as bad behaviour rather than adults taking responsibility for the fact that they didn't communicate in the right way for those particular young people. But when we support young people's communication, we hear things like this. Now, these quotes come from a young person whose FGC and court proceedings were adapted to support his communication strengths and needs. And at the end, he said to his communication assistant, "I want to say thank you for helping me to understand what's going on, like what's happening in court. I reckon I wouldn't be here now if I didn't understand all that." And he went on to say, "I know that I can know stuff now, so that's mean." And I'm so pleased that he felt that way at the end of his proceeding. But I'm also so sad that he was 16 or 17 and in a court process before he understood that he could understand. Like, he should have known that when he was 5 and 7 and 9. And our systems have let him down very, very badly in the past. So our challenge to everyone is to be as good a communication partner as you possibly can. And I'll just talk you through this slide. I'm going to start on the left-hand side. Our suggestion would be that to be a good communication partner, you need to think about what's the conversation that you need to have and what's going to make it complicated. And you need to think about what have you noticed or what do you know about the communication skills of the people you're talking to? What are their strengths? What have you noticed that doesn't work well for them? And based on those two things, you think about what's the best way for me to have this conversation with these particular people. Now, most of us rely on talking, and we would suggest that that's not a good thing to do. We would say, yes, you can talk, absolutely talk, but make it simpler and use simpler phrases. We would say back that up with simple pictures, diagrams, stick people, boxes and arrows, and also back it up with writing just some keywords, the main things that you want people to remember. And we would say that by doing those things, you're giving somebody 3 chances to understand and participate in the conversation, rather than relying on just talking, which is often a dodgy medium for people. So I'm going to show you an example about what that might look like. So if you put those 3 principles in action, hold on, just waiting for, oh, here we go. Let me just go back. So this conversation I'm about to show you is a collaboration between a youth advocate, a young person, and a communication assistant. The youth advocate wanted to talk to the young person about the drivers of their offending, but he knew that the young person would really struggle to give him kind of enough information or coherent information. So he asked a communication assistant for help. And this is how they had the conversation. Now, I'm not telling you this so that you think I need to have a communication assistant in all of my conversations. The youth advocate involved here, once he had seen this technique or this strategy, he can now use it himself. But anyway, the communication assistant started by drawing this timeline because she wanted to signal to the young person that they were going to talk not just about the stuff that happened, but we're going to talk about what happened in the past and also what happened in the future. So he could see the amount of time that was going to be covered in the conversation. And then to have the conversation, all they needed to do was kind of to point in the direction of when he was a baby and say simple, open questions like, what was happening? What else? What else? And as the young person spoke, the communication assistant would just jot down on a post-it the key thing that he had said. Now, this part of the strategy is actually very important because those few moments that it takes the communication assistant or the listener to write down the key word or phrase, that's buying the young person some time to think about what else they might want to say. And it's doing that in a very natural way, which makes sure that the young person doesn't feel shamed about the time it takes them to think. The other advantage of plotting this very visual story is that the young person was able to notice if he'd left gaps in his story, or if there was a part of if there was something that somebody wanted to hear more about, they could maybe point to the bit where, okay, so you were talking about synthetics and Cody's. Tell me a wee bit more about that. And so through this process, the young person was able to really tell his story about all the things that he had been having to manage in his life up to this point. And he was able to come up with some really brilliant strategies or things to include in his plan. And so we would love to see people adapting their communication like this more often. Another collaboration that's really important when you're thinking about an FGC is collaborating with the Whānau, with young person, with the victim, not only about the right way to have this FGC for them or the right place to have it or the right people to have there. And my colleague Tracy Karanui-Golf has some ideas about that and she's talking tomorrow. But also talk about what's the right language to have this meeting in. And that might be Te Reo Māori or Tongan or Samoan or Gujarati or whatever. But also think about the complexity of the language. Find out from the Whānau what language works best for you. And a good question to ask, like if you know that the family are maybe involved in WINS, you can say, so when you're talking to WINS about your benefits, what makes that easy? What makes it hard? If it's a young person who's been in school, ask them, so when you've had to listen in class, what makes it easy? What makes it hard? Which teachers are hard to listen to or easy to listen to? Why? Because often the people that we're talking to can have some really good advice about what works well for them. So for example, a young person that I was working with said, you know, write it down, I'm not a fast thinker. So ask people about what works for them. Another collaboration is one that you can do within your own organization. think about all the tasks that you ask people to take part in, all the conversations you ask them to take part in, and think about what skills does the person need to have to be able to have this conversation. So if we think about the drivers of offending conversation, you need to be able to remember, you need to be able to think in the past and think about the future. You need to be able to reflect on what you were thinking about. You might need to think about what somebody else was thinking about. That all can bring a communication demand. So have a go at this activity with your own organization and see what you can do to adapt some of the things, some of the ways you have those conversations. Now, this slide is really just a reminder that when you're collaborating with your FGC stakeholders, you need to think about not just supporting communication during the FGC, but also what do you need to support before and what do you need to support after. And I've put some ideas there, but I'm not going to go through them now. I'm just going to show you some examples of what those might look like. But a reminder that once you're in the FGC, it can be really hard to not slip into your usual blah, 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 jargon, keep talking. And so there needs to be somebody who's going to remind your group that, hang on a wee minute, we decided we were going to do this differently. And there's a lovely FGC coordinator in Rotorua who has worked out a really a way to communicate this to the FGC team in a way that makes sure that nobody is shamed. So it might be that you want to look at having simpler version of charges, and you can see there that we've got the jargon because people often need to learn some of this jargon, but we've also got the simpler definition for it. We want to encourage you to check comprehension more effectively. A lot of people just say things like, did you get that? That's all good. But really what you need to do is to hear hear a young person's explanation of what you said, hear it in their words. And in this situation, you can imagine there was a conversation about staying within your curfew. And the speaker says, I might not have said that clearly. What does that mean to you? I have to stay in the red lines on the photo you showed me. Why? Because the bracelet knows when I go over the lines, the police might come. So in this way, you've kind of collaboratively created meaning with the young person, and you've checked that not only do they understand it, but they also know the consequences of the information. Again, using our doodling strategy, this one might be if you're working with a victim who maybe finds it hard to talk about the impact of the offending, you can use this strategy to find out more about how they feel. Or if your victim is very articulate and created a very moving victim impact statement, you might need to create a simpler version to help the young person understand that impact. What do your FGC invitations look like? Perhaps they could look and look more attractive, and perhaps they could have the information more simply stated. A lovely FGC coordinator in Tamariki created this, and she also has versions in other languages for when that is required. Collaborate with your young person or Whānau about what can they do during the meeting to advocate for their communication needs. How are they going to signal when they need to have a break, or when it's all getting a bit too much, or when it's hard for them to be calm. Think about adapting the way you run your FGCs. A wonderful FGC coordinator in Auckland now has 2 whiteboards in her FGC room. One has the blank template you can see in that picture, and the other is a blank whiteboard. And when they talk about things like where somebody's going to live, she takes the icon of the house that you can see on the right-hand side, and she blue tacks that onto the blank whiteboard so that she can just jot down the ideas that come up in the room. And this means that when it gets to family time and the professionals leave, the family are left with this memory board of the conversation, and their job is to take each icon, so where you're going to live, put it in the template that you can see on the screen, and jot down what they think the best idea is. And then when the professionals come back, the plan can be agreed or renegotiated. But what it means is that the family can think about the plan without having the demand of trying to remember everything that was said, because someone has very helpfully put all that information down somewhere for them. And then at the end of the FGC, maybe you want to have a plan or report that looks simpler and that people might be more interested in reading, because you've taken away all of the unnecessary jargon or blah. And this is one that we co-created with FGC coordinators down in Tamariki, and it's been developed a wee bit further since then as well. But you can see you still have all the information that is needed legally, but it's also easier to look at and less information to read. And there you can see at the very end the bail conditions in a visual form. So my last couple of slides are just some resources that you might find interesting. They're free to download from the website. This is a resource that we have built for our Aotearoa context in conjunction with Talking Mats in Scotland, but we wanted stuff that would relate to our communities. And another really useful website to have a look at. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry that was so fast, but hopefully by having some visuals for you to look at, you've got an idea of the principles that I've been hoping to communicate with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alayne. What a great fact that speaking is not always the only and the best way to communicate, and there's some really good practice that I think that we'll all certainly draw on. We have a few questions. One of them I'll start. Alayne, it's fantastic to see examples of staff have incorporated and embedded some of the advice and strategies into their work. It might be making a huge difference for the young people and their families, as a comment. In a family group conference meeting, to understand the charges with police, youth aid don't break it down for them, especially when English is their second language. Simplifying it for families may be something OT and police youth aid can work together on before the family group conference. Question?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there are two things there. I think one is if we know that somebody's if we know that English is a second language for somebody, it makes sense to have the really important high stakes information in their first language. That would be my first thing that I would say. And the second one about OT and youth aid, thinking about adapting information around the charges, great idea. And sometimes that happens really, really well. I think there is a little bit of inconsistency. Sometimes you will have youth aid officers who believe that they have to read stuff out exactly the way it is on the page in front of them, and that they're legally required to do that. And then there are others who feel more confident that as long as they remain legally correct in terms of the wording of the charge, that the way that is communicated can be supported by visuals. When there's a communication assistant involved, they will often create a visual of each charge. That, you know, if it's about having broken a quarter light, they'll have a picture of a car and there'll be a wee arrow to the quarter light that says this is broken, this is the model and the make of the car. So and again, obviously you don't have to be a communication assistant to do that, but it's a really good point, and I would love to see it be mainstream practice.
Another question, is there significant difference that needs to be taken into account in the community for young people with neurodiversity?
I guess I deliberately haven't tried to use any particular labels, because I think some people may need support with their communication because it's a very stressful thing. Their communication might actually be intact. So I would be saying that absolutely people neuro disability may well need some adaptations being made, but I would always be guided by the person in front of you. So if they're showing that they have difficulty paying attention to you, whether they have a label or something or not, that would, to me, would be a signal to, let's make sure that we don't ask them to pay attention for too long. Let's build in more breaks so that your strategy responds to the person and their strengths, any challenges you've noticed, rather than to a diagnosis.
Okay. Actually used up all of our time. Thank you, Alayne, for an amazing presentation. Thank you, everybody, for attending this morning's sessions. We're going to take a short break and then roll into the following sessions for later on this afternoon. Thanks, everybody. Morning.